Good morning. Welcome to the Nixon Presidential Library and Celebrating Women's Impact. This timely symposium during Women's History Month will explore post-war 20th century advancements in the role of women in government. Many of you may not realize that President Nixon was the first to push for more women in high-level government and leadership positions. A single question from Washington reporter Vera Glasser at Nixon's first White House press conference in February 1969 got the ball rolling. Glasser asked why there were only 3 women among the 200 new administration appointments that had been announced. Taken aback, Nixon pledged to address the imbalance. As a seasoned politician, he created a special task force to delve into the issue. The Women's Rights and Responsibilities Task Force appropriately titled its final report, A Matter of Simple Justice. One of the task force members, Dr. Dee Boersma, was a graduate student and was chosen to represent the opinions of young people. She is one of our panelists today. Another panelist, former Secretary of Commerce Barbara Franklin, was Nixon's special assistant responsible for recruiting women for executive service and leadership in government. Like me, Barbara believes in service to our nation, and you will be hearing from her in just a few minutes as well. During Nixon's administration, more women were placed in mid-level government positions and appointed to boards and commissions than ever before. The number of women in high-level executive positions also increased. The story of Nixon's efforts to bring more women in government was truly an epic tale. It is one of the many intriguing aspects of the Nixon presidency that can be studied in the archives at the Nixon Library. In 2010, the National Archives and the Nixon Foundation began co-sponsoring a series of Nixon Legacy Forums, where former members of the Nixon White House staff and academic experts take part in moderated discussions on behind-the-scenes work during the Nixon administration. Today's symposium follows the Legacy Forum format, bringing together the people who made history with the people who study it, but we have greatly expanded the topics for discussion. It was only last May when President Biden appointed me as the first woman to lead the National Archives in its 90-year history. We still have a lot of work to do to get more women into the highest echelons of government. We have a great group of panelists today who will offer their insights into the role of women in government over time. I'm confident that the future of women in government is a bright one. And it will be as long as we have women like Vera Glasser standing up and asking the questions that change the course of history. Thank you, and enjoy the symposium.
And thank you, Colleen. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jim Byron. I am the president and CEO of the Richard Nixon Foundation. And welcome to the Nixon Library this morning for what is sure to be a fascinating series of conversations. Today, celebrating women's impact. Across 4 panels, we will look at the women's movement in the 1960s and 70s, focusing in particular on the strategic Nixon White House initiative to identify and hire women into the senior roles of the federal government. And as new scholarship contends, First Lady Pat Nixon played a decisive behind-the-scenes role to keep this initiative moving, which will be the subject of one of our panels today. The person recruited to lead this effort in the Nixon administration was Barbara Hackman Franklin, then a recent graduate of the Harvard Business School and a newly minted executive at First National City Bank. This resulted in nearly quadrupling the number of women in these senior positions between 1971 and 1973. Her White House story is told in the 2012 book by Lee Stout, A Matter of Simple Justice, the untold story of Barbara Hackman Franklin and a Few Good Women. Ms. Franklin would become Secretary Franklin in 1992 when she was appointed and confirmed as United States Secretary of Commerce serving under President George H.W. Bush. She served or is serving on 14 corporate boards and is a Director Emerita of the Richard Nixon Foundation. To begin this symposium, please welcome, joining us via Zoom, Secretary Franklin.
For a most gracious introduction. And may I add my welcome to all of you there. This should be a really exciting morning. And I'm so pleased that Colleen mentioned Vera Glasser, who was a very brave woman in a sea of men in that press room back then in 1969. And I came to know Vera quite well, and she was the real thing. And we owe her a vote of thanks too. Anyway, I'm only wishing I could be there with you in person, but hello from afar. Well, there's much to celebrate in this Women's History Month as we recall the advances that were made in the early 1970s in the administration of President Richard Nixon. And I'm honored to have played a part in that element of women's history. What happened was this. President Nixon, early after he took office in 1969, and I might say subsequent to Vera's question, made known his desire to bring more women into the federal government. His approach was powerful. First, he required goals and action plans of his cabinet secretaries and agency heads, all men, I might add, about how they would advance women in their departments. And second, I was brought in, as Jim just told you, from First National City Bank in New York to recruit the women for the top jobs, the policymaking jobs, and to monitor the progress that the cabinets and agencies were making toward their goals. Now, progress reports went periodically to the president. And when a cabinet secretary met a goal, he received a nice congratulatory note from the president. If he did not, he would receive another sort of note from the president. Now, I know that because I was the one drafting those notes and sending them to the boss. Well, at the end of the first year, we had tripled the numbers of women in policymaking jobs, and that went on up to quadrupled in the next year. The important point here is that the majority of those jobs were firsts. In other words, the first time a woman had held that job. And then we moved 1,000 women up into the middle management ranks. So barriers were broken, and happily, they stayed down in the coming years. And I want to add here that many people helped to make this happen, which is, I think, always what is the source of change that sticks and lasts. Now, I believe the success and the example of the federal government in those days caused a ripple effect through our society, as many other professions and lines of work opened up more fully to women. I think President Nixon was ahead of his time. And I was only a few years out of Harvard Business School. I was very young then, and remember well that our society did not have a consensus about the proper role of women. But because the President of the United States, in this case, President Richard Nixon, did what he did, a cultural change began to move women's equality forward faster. The great Henry Kissinger summed it up this way, and I quote, "Many younger people may not realize what a significant cultural change in women's rights began with Nixon," close quote. This is something worth remembering and celebrating today. Now, I understand that the bust of Susan B. Anthony is in full view They're in your room. I hope you will say hello to her for me. She was gifted to the to the White House at a presentation to Mrs. Nixon in early 1973. And then she stood on a pedestal at the entrance of the East Wing, which is the First Lady's wing in the White House, for the better part of a decade. Then she went into storage and was found again 50 years later and is now on loan to the library from the White House. And she arrived at the library in 2022, just as we were going to celebrate the 50 years since the signing of Title IX, which was a great advancement to women that happened, or for women that happened during the Nixon era as he signed that law. Now, there's a backstory to this that I want to share with you, and I hope it makes you smile. In the fall of 1972, two women's groups, the Task Force on Women's Rights and Responsibilities and the Citizens Advisory Council on the Status of Women, came to me and said they would like to gift a bust of Susan B. Anthony, the great suffragist, to the White House in honor of what President Nixon had done to elevate women in the federal government. I thought that was a wonderful idea, and they proceeded to get it done. They had a copy made of the marble bust of Susan B., which is in the US Capitol. Now, this one is bronze, made in upstate New York. And the White House then received, the White House complex received the bust, it was delivered. And then we had to wait for a date when we could schedule a presentation to Mrs. Nixon. Well, while we waited, Susan B. lived in the closet in my office, which was on the third floor of the old executive office building. Sometimes in the dead of night, she would steal out of that office, out of my closet, and land in the office of someone who had said or done something detrimental to women. So of course, I had to go pick her up in the morning, put her back in the closet. But it was known that the spirit of Susan B. Anthony roamed the White House at night. So if you're a man, beware, was the message. Well, a final note about that. I think it was quite appropriate that Mrs. Nixon was the one to receive this symbolic gift, because I do think that she was an inspiration, as Jim said, behind the president's move to advance women. And so we're grateful to her as well as being grateful to the president. So thank you all for coming. As I said, I wish I were there with you. I think you will have an informative and inspiring day. And I hope you will leave with the momentum and the desire to create more history for women. So have a good day.
Thank you, Secretary Franklin. And before I introduce the moderator and my colleague of the first panel, I want to also acknowledge another special guest in the audience, Maureen Nunn, who is a member of the Nixon Foundation's Board of Directors, along with Secretary Franklin. And Maureen, thank you for being here with us this morning. I just alluded to her presence, but ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Tamara Martin. She's the director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library with the National Archives and Records Administration, and she will moderate this morning's first panel.
I'm muted, so it's okay.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tamara Martin, and I'm the director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. I'm very, very excited for today's event, and I wanted to welcome you all here today. This is the Nixon Library's 2024 Women's History Symposium entitled Celebrating Women's Impact. This event is hosted at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in beautiful Yorba Linda, California. Thank you to those of us who have joined today in person, as well as those who are tuning in virtually and our viewers on C-SPAN. Before we start our first panel, I wanted to note a few items. The Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum is one of 15 presidential libraries that are a part of the National Archives and Records Administration Office of Presidential Libraries, which is located in College Park, Maryland. We share our campus with our wonderful partners, the Richard Nixon Foundation, and our primary mission is to educate and inform, assisting all those who search for knowledge and understanding of the 37th President of the United States, his administration, and his ongoing impact on the world. Today's program is being live streamed today on the Richard Nixon Foundation, the National Archives and Records Administration, the Nixon Presidential Library's YouTube channels, and will be available after the program for you to view again, enjoy, and share with your friends. Since this is our inaugural Women's History Symposium, we are thrilled to have such a robust program and so many accomplished individuals who are participating today. Beginning with the 1968 presidential campaign, Richard Nixon announced his support for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. As president, he continued to support women's equality through his support and signing of the Education Amendments Act of 1972, which included Title IX, and the creation of the Presidential Task Force on Women's Rights and Responsibilities, as well as many other things. In today's panels, we will explore post-war 20th century advancements in the role of women in government with panelists who not only worked in the Nixon White House, but those who studied the records that they created. This is a unique opportunity and a very special program today. Our day will feature 4 panels, each of which will be 60 minutes long, with approximately 15 minutes in between each panel. Our panels will include panel number 1, which is Telling Women's History Through Historical Records, panel 2, Nixon Programs and Administration and Legislation, panel 3, Women in Presidential Administrations, panel 4, The Impact of Pat Nixon and Other First Ladies, and we also wanted to extend a special thank you to our colleagues at C-SPAN who are covering today's event, and it will air on one of their programs at a later date. A special thank you to our panelists and moderators, as well as the dedicated staff at the Nixon Library, the Richard Nixon Foundation, the National Archives, the Nixon Docent Guild, and many others who have worked tirelessly to make today's event possible. We appreciate each and every one of you. So today, I am very honored to moderate our first panel, which is Telling Women's History Through Historical Records. I started as the Nixon Library Director in April of 2023, so I'm almost done with my very first year here. Before that, I was the California State Archivist, and in that role, I directed one of the largest state archival institutions in the United States. So this topic is one of my very favorites, which is historical records. So now I would like to introduce you to our esteemed panel. First, we have Dr. Tiffany Gonzalez, who will come up to the stage here with us. Go ahead and clap for her. So she is an assistant professor of history at the University of Kansas, and she's also been here with us this week researching for her upcoming book, which is related to the Equal Rights Amendment, as well as Mexican-American women's involvement in the Nixon administration. Our second panelist that we have is Heath Hardage Lee, who will be joining us virtually. Is she on screen? Yes, perfect, thank you. She is an award-winning historian, biographer, and curator who specializes in women's history. Heath's narrative nonfiction book, The League of Wives, The Untold Story of the Women Who Took on the U.S. Government, to bring their husbands home for Vietnam was published by St. Martin's Press in 2019. League of Wives is currently being developed into a television series, which is pretty exciting. Heath also writes about women's history and politics for publications such as Time, The Hill, The Atlantic, and White House History Quarterly. Her new book, The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, The Life and Times of Washington's Most Private First Lady, will be released in August of this year. Our third panelist today is Nancy Kegan Smith, who will also be joining us virtually. She is the former director of the Presidential Materials Division at the National Archives and Records Administration. She worked with materials related to President Nixon, and she was appointed by former Archivist of the United States, Don Wilson, to be a senior archival panel which decided on 2,500 documents that had been contested by the former president in the late 1980s, early 1990s, from opening in terms of whether or not they were personal records. She also supervised the re-review of Nixon tapes that had been proposed for opening but were contested. She is the founding member and the president of the First Ladies Association for Research and Education, FLAIR. She is also the co-author with Diana Carlin and Anita B. McBride of 2 books, which are U.S. First Ladies, Making History and Leaving Legacies, and Remember the First Ladies, America's History Making Women. She also co-edited Modern First Ladies, Their Documentary Legacy. So now we can go ahead and get started. So each of you has spent time either researching with us or working with records as an archivist. So before we start discussing your research in more detail, if you could please let us know what inspired you or started you on your path of research or your work with primary source documents. So I thought we could start with Nancy and then go to Heath and then go to Tiffany.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you to the Nixon Foundation for doing this symposium and the Nixon Library and Museum. What started me are several factors. My mother was a historian, the first woman chair at the University of California at Berkeley of the American Studies Department. Her name was Dr. Adrienne Koch. And so I grew up, she was great in research, in doing primary and original research. So I grew up with primary and original research being a must and love of history. And I started at the LBJ Library, my career with the government, with the National Archives, which was 44 years at the LBJ Library, and worked with Dr. Lewis Gold, who is the pioneer in First Lady Studies, on his pioneering book on Lady Bird Johnson and the environment. Still, you can count on one hand the number of books on a First Lady that deal with a topic rather than are just biographical. And then finally, an inspiration was working with Lady Bird Johnson, getting to know her, and it created my love of First Ladies and the research I have so enjoyed doing on First Ladies.
That's wonderful, thank you. Heath, do you mind sharing with us as well?
Sure. Yes. Thank you all for hosting us today. When I was in college, back in the dark ages, women's history was only beginning to be a thing. So I was at Davidson College in North Carolina, and I had 2 amazing female professors, Dr. Sally McMillan, who's a renowned scholar of women's history, and Dr. Barbara Ballard, who was teaching African-American history at the time. And both those women set me on the path to writing a thesis. We had a sort of a special honors thesis program there where you worked all with primary source documents to write your thesis. So I did work on that, went all over the country as a college student, and that thesis eventually became my first book that was published with the University of Nebraska Press, which was a post-Civil War history. Then I went from that book, working at Virginia Historical Society in Richmond, now Virginia Museum of History and Culture. After I spoke there about that book, the staff said, Heath, you need to come look at these primary source documents about Phyllis Galante. She was one of the prisoner of war wives that starred in my League of Wives book, which led me to the Nixon Library, where I began working on that. It worked extensively on that topic at the Nixon Library, which then led me to working on Mrs. Nixon at the Nixon Library. So it's so interesting. It was all really based on primary source research and oral histories, being trained in how to take those and how to interpret those. So the trail led me twice to the Nixon Library. So that's been interesting and not surprising that one primary source subject leads to one that isn't maybe too far away.
That's great. Thank you so much. And the same question for you, Tiffany.
Thank you. I guess for me, it's kind of a whirlwind. I started with the intrigue as an undergraduate student in Texas, wondering about, I really loved women's history classes, and in those classes, I would question, well, what was women's roles in politics, not just community organizing, but also as elected officials. And those questions kind of derived towards my other passion of taking political science classes, where I wouldn't learn about women's history over there, so I would start asking those questions. Well, what role did women have? And so as a young undergraduate student, that really drove my questions for graduate research. And when I entered graduate school, I really didn't know much more than the questions that I had until I started reading a little bit more into the literature. And then my questions evolved. Well, what about Mexican-American women? How did Mexican-American women shape electoral politics and government and representation? And I started finding there's not very much written so far. And my passion of those questions kind of also led me into my determination to start writing about that, writing and researching about that, and what led me to now what is my current first book manuscript about Chicanas, how they broke into the political mainstream. And that opened up a treasure trove of understanding how Mexican-American women at large shaped not just the Democratic Party, but also the Republican Party. And that's what brought me to the Nixon Library. At first, when I arrived, I didn't know what to expect. Will I find any documents? I don't know. Do I have the time? Yes, that's why I'm here. Do I have the patience? Yeah, because I have the passion. So as I was going through records, I found some records in what I already knew was of one woman, Anita Martinez, out of Dallas, who was the first councilwoman in Dallas as a Mexican-American woman to serve from 69 to 73. But in that, what I learned is also her connection to Nixon and how Nixon recruited her to be part of his administration through a volunteer committee that he created. And he recruited folks from across the nation to not only help them bring them into the fold within his administration, but also kind of to garner some type of loyalty with the Spanish-speaking community. And so that really what opened me up to understanding that Mexican-American women really had a role not only in the Democratic Party, as we could imagine, but also the Republican Party, and how that shapes our understanding today of how Latinas at large are so pivotal with the Republican Party in the forefront when we see national media, especially when we see them during campaign seasons, and especially in Texas. That's where we see a lot of Latinas coming out for the Republican Party. So it allows me to kind of understand that historical trajectory of what brought me to the Nixon Library in the beginning.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Would you say that those were some of the most interesting records that you've researched here, or were there others that you found interesting?
Yeah, absolutely. When I first started researching Anita Martinez's story, of course, it was slivers of paper hidden within documents. And that's where every document that I found with her name, even if it was just her name, was so important to me because it cemented her place within his administration. even the name. But the other aspect of that, when I was researching, I said, well, if her name's here and she was appointed and selected by Nixon, would there be photographs? There sure are. There's photographs of her. So that was the other, I think, that really so pivotal in my process of recovering that history of Mexican American women within Nixon's administration.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for sharing with us. And a question for you, Nancy. Could you provide some examples of particularly useful documents about First Ladies that you came across in your research? And were there any surprising revelations that you found in those documents?
Well, the presidential libraries have wonderful material to research on First Ladies, including textual files, audiovisual files, photographic files. At some libraries, there are audio tapes, Mrs. Johnson's diary, which you can listen to. So all of those are wonderful records. Particularly useful documents on First Ladies are those that change or really enlighten us in concept. And one that I can think of that is really revolutionary in terms of the role of a First Lady is when I interviewed Mrs. Johnson in 1987, she told me that Jackie Kennedy, 3 days after John F. Kennedy had been assassinated, had her over to tea at the White House on November 26th. Mrs. Johnson was still living at the Elms, and Mrs. Johnson thought it was just going to be about household and about how the White House ran. But no, instead, Mrs. Kennedy had a passion. And Mrs. Johnson said she was so together and looked so beautiful for someone who had suffered such an incredible tragedy. And she asked Mrs. Johnson something that really never has been done before, which is if she would carry on her White House restoration initiative and make it permanent. She wanted a permanent curator for the White House, and she wanted her committee to be formalized. And she then said she would give Mrs. Johnson a 7-page handwritten letter, which is a yellow legal pad and is at the Johnson Library, that detailed her plans. In March of 1964, President Johnson made a committee for preservation of the White House permanent and a permanent White House curator. So Mrs. Johnson told me her first initiative was to help Jackie Kennedy, and she wanted to do anything she could. She wasn't thinking of doing White House restoration. The fine arts world, she wasn't as familiar with, but she took it over, became a great advocate, carried on Jackie Kennedy's efforts, finished the Rose Garden, and added Americana to the White House. So that is just one example of a key document that you can find that can totally change your impression of a First Lady's role or add or enlighten you on it.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that, and it's very, very interesting. So Heath, we wanted to bring up your book, League of Wives, which is a story of a courageous group of women who fought to get their husbands, who were prisoners of war, home during the Vietnam War. What unique collections and documents helped you in developing the narrative for your book?
Yes, well, President Nixon was so key, and Mrs. Nixon as well, in the POW issue, of course. So I came to the library, I believe it was in 2016, for the first time with the Robert J. Dole Political Institute. Senator Dole was a huge advocate of these women as well. So I came with the Dole team. When I was writing my book, I was also doing an exhibit for the Dole Institute, which ended up, the book and the exhibit ended up being sort of done simultaneously, which I would not recommend if you're doing a book. It was a lot at once, but they both added to each other a lot. It made it very rich. So there were sort of two products of that. And the Nixon Library, NARA, and the foundation were both so helpful in that pursuit, because I came in looking for pictures, much like Tiffany did, looking for pictures, evidence that the wives were with President Nixon. Indeed, there were so many pictures, I couldn't even pick, just one. I ended up using a lot of pictures in my book. One of them, actually, a cover image, came partially from the archive of President Nixon on December 12th, 1969, standing with the POW wives, going public with the POW problem, which previously had been kept quiet. So that was kind of a sea change, illustrated by the pictures in the archive. The other documents that I found that I'll talk about throughout the day were something regarding, they were telegrams, actually, that the POW and MIA wives had sent to President Nixon and his White House staff, urging him to make the POW issue very public. It had not been before, and that this was key to getting their support. So I had, from one end, I had the wives' telegrams that they had given me from private collections. And then when I came to the Nixon Library and Archive, I found hundreds of responses from President Nixon, from his staff, all personally signed to these wives. So that is a great example of a document that, was kind of from both ends. I was able to see both sides of it. And it was key that I see that within the archive. And I'll talk a little bit later about the significance of that telegram and the format in terms of the wives and political activism. But the archive was very key to finding those telegrams and other documents related to the press conference.
That's great, thank you. And through the documents that you were researching, how did it reflect the growing political voice of women in the United States, and what impact did it have on the president and the White House team?
Yes, and again, the telegram, I love the women called it a telegram in. And of course, in the 60s and 70s, with the civil rights movement, with the feminist movement, of course, with gay rights, many sit-ins, and so what I loved is my very conservative POW MIA wives borrowed the techniques of all these movements and applied them to a telegram in to President Nixon, that we saw that evidence in the archive and in their own private collections. So that shows you, that's a great example of that grassroots political activism of the POW MIA lobby with these wives, coming, taking elements of these other movements that were not at all politically on their side of the spectrum, but taking them and adapting them for their own use. And so I thought that was quite a good example of that, of how things were changing so much for women, particularly in my, for what I was interested in the 60s and 70s. And you really see that in the archive, in the NARA archive, and also in the foundation documents at the Nixon Library. That was fantastic. And I do want to mention again that every single one of those telegrams that the wives sent, they got a personal answer from the president or from someone high level on the administration, which was just unheard of. And I think that, to answer the second part of your question, the staff, that is how you knew the staff was really on board with that, because everyone was instructed not only to answer, but to personally sign it. So very significant finding, and I did mention that in the book. So a real support, also to echo what Secretary Franklin said earlier, this is when we're starting to see women be more uplifted in a bigger, more public way, I think, than before, in terms of appointing someone like Secretary Franklin. At that time, she was the guru of getting women into higher levels of government. And that was President Nixon. And it was also Mrs. Nixon. I found much evidence pushing behind the scenes for that to happen.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And Tiffany, in your research, what have the documents told you about the Nixon administration's role in recruiting women in government? And do you think it was a positive step forward for gender equality?
Yeah, that's a great question. Within my research within Mexican American women, I mean, another aspect that I research is the Equal Rights Amendment and how Mexican American women fought for that through the National Women's Political Caucus. When I specifically look at Mexican American women, I draw a lot from historian Jerry Cadava, what he's written on the Hispanic Republican right. His argument is that for some way it was strategic of Nixon to recruit the Spanish-speaking constituency so that he would have a greater voter outcome and build loyalty within that quote-unquote forgotten people, forgotten minority within the United States. So when examining the Republican women that he appointed or recruited within his administration, a lot of the documents tell me is that, you know, the categories, when he's speaking to his colleagues in his administration, I want someone that's Spanish speaking, I want someone from California, and I want someone from, that's a woman. So that aligns with, you know, his call and his mission for advancing women in several positions of appointed in his committees. But what I find within Mexican American women, when I just look at within that history and the numbers, that's very low within several committees and cabinets, right? So when I look at Mexican American that way, to some extent representation matters for equality, but to what extent? But the other side of that is when these women are in their appointed roles, such as Ramona Buñuelos, who is the first Mexican-American woman, Hispanic woman to serve as treasurer for the United States. She was appointed under Nixon. In speeches that she conducts within the communities and several organizations, she talks about how important it is to have women in government and politics. So although Nixon didn't perhaps have the foresight to see that how women would be talking about their role and how important gender is within politics, that is an advancement of gender equality, women's equality within his administration. They're using their voice to shape consciousness to the public that they're speaking to. But I still struggle with the limited number of Mexican American women appointed within his administration. So representation mattered, but I think it didn't meet the mark when his views of who should be appointed in his administration in advancing women during his time in office.
Thank you. And then Nancy, through your research, what were the expectations of a first lady at the beginning of the Nixon administration, and how has the office evolved that you've seen through the documents since World War II?
Well, the expectations up until the Nixon administration, and it still goes on today, but definitely up until the Nixon administration, the expectation was that the First Lady, which really started with Martha and evolved, would head up the ceremonial and social function for the president. And that was such a key function that was shown throughout history to facilitate a good reception. When Dolly did her receptions, facilitated legislation for James Madison, creating a bipartisan atmosphere. And so certainly the social and ceremonial role was very important. Increasingly after Eleanor Roosevelt and in the 20th century, First Ladies take on much more of a political public role. Mrs. Johnson does her solo campaign in 1964, the Whistle Stop campaign to push civil rights. Certainly Pat Nixon campaign, as did Lady Bird throughout the campaigns and was a partner. So increasingly First Ladies are expected to take more of a public role, are under more scrutiny. And of course, with the advent of television, they have to become more media savvy. Mrs. Johnson hired the first professional press secretary. So the office evolves a little bit with Liz Carpenter. Jackie Kennedy hired a press secretary, but she was not professional. And Franklin, very frankly, Jackie didn't use her press secretary that much. She sort of had a love-hate relationship with the press. Mrs. Johnson came from a journalistic background on TV and radio stations. She used the press to facilitate. She created special events, brought the press in and to highlight her programs. And Pat Nixon championed volunteerism and was the first personal ambassador for a president, and used the press to advertise, like her Peru trip in 1970, her African trip in 1972, very effectively. Jimmy Carter and Rosalynn both agreed that one of their biggest fights ever was that Rosalynn was working so hard, but she did not have enough staffing. But Jimmy had come in undercutting staffing. And Rosalynn said they had a huge fight because he was supportive of her work, but she needed more of a staff. So finally she won. And in 1978, Jimmy Carter signs the White House Personnel Authorization Act, which officially named and Congress finally authorized a government-paid staff for the spouse and named the office of the First Lady. So beginning with Mrs. Carter, there was a more formal staff structure, a staff director, and then with Nancy Reagan, a chief of staff, communications directors, media directors, and the staff has fluctuated from 16 to 25 people, depending on the needs of the First Lady. So it was really, Pat Nixon was on the cusp of the evolution of the office of the First Lady.
That's great. What were some of the differences you saw in your research between First Ladies Pat Nixon, Jacqueline Kennedy, and Lady Bird Johnson? And what were some of the documents that you used to read about them?
Well, there clearly is a difference. There's certainly a stylistic difference. Jackie was so ever elegant and used that in terms of foreign diplomacy. Lady Bird came in and she wasn't as much into fashion. Lyndon coached her. She called Lyndon her Mr. Higgins. And she cared about fashion, but not to the extent, and she never tried to be or could be Jackie Kennedy. And she used her love of nature, civil rights, early childhood education, and used the press to create special events with Liz to promote those all over the nation. So there was a difference there. And then Pat Nixon used the press in terms of her volunteerism, in terms of her travels, the wonderful pictures of Pat in Africa, in the Peruvian earthquake, and the incredible goodwill she created in Peru. She had a great deal of empathy. Pat didn't just go to very formal things when she traveled. She reached out. She would go to many First Ladies have, but Pat made sure she went to soldiers in the hospital. She went to the Peruvian common people to talk to them about what the earthquake had done. And so there was a lot of empathy. I think really when you think about it, there's a lot of similarity in the backgrounds of Pat Nixon and Lady Bird Johnson, because both had been the spouse of a vice president. Both had husbands with long political careers and were very political. Mrs. Johnson somewhat more so than Pat Nixon. Jackie Kennedy hated politics. She hated what she called the back rooms and the cigar smoke. And so she let Mrs. Johnson do a bunch of campaigning for her in the 1960 campaign. Plus, she was pregnant and couldn't actually do a lot of campaigning. But so there was similarity there in terms of style. I've already mentioned that. There is programs. Of course, first ladies always followed the passion of their hearts. So they were different in their programs. Jackie Kennedy, White House Restoration, Lady Bird Johnson, Civil Rights, early childhood education, and of course the environment, and Pat Nixon volunteerism and personal ambassador. But very interestingly, all three were very similar in that they championed White House restoration. All three made very important contributions in White House restoration, and I'm sure Heath's book will further illuminate the very significant contributions Pat Nixon made to caring about a White House tour being available to disabled people, and bringing in a lot of traditional antique furniture. Mrs. Johnson brought in Americana, so all three were very similar there. So I think that gives you some of the similarities and differences between the first ladies.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Heath, related to your new upcoming book, if you're able to share with us, what were some of the records that you used here at the Nixon Library to learn more about Pat Nixon?
Sure. Well, first I want to say Nancy's overview of the similarities of first ladies is excellent, and I could not agree more with her comments. Second, as we get into the archival things I used, I do want to thank Jason Schwartz at the foundation. He was my Jedi Master guide to the foundation, and then Christine Mickey and Ryan Pettigrew on the National Archives side. And there is a nice collaborative relationship there that it was very helpful to me in doing the research. I had everybody helping, and it just made all the difference. I have such a vast list of what I got into. If you're into archives and museums, as Tiffany, Nancy, and I are, it's like Christmas. Like you want to rip into, maybe not rip into, that wouldn't be good for the documents, but you want to delve into these gems. It's like a treasure chest of things. And it's more a process of like slimming it down and giving the archivist, I know Jason particularly told me this was so helpful, to give them a list when you come to the archive and try to slim it down for them, and not just say, give me everything you have on Pat Nixon. That is not going to work. So I did spend a lot of time slimming my list down, looking online at the collections to know what I needed to see. And then you go in and you don't know what is going to be most helpful. But I will say a little preview of my book coming in August on Mrs. Nixon, 2 collections that I found incredibly helpful. The Patricia Ryan Nixon collection, which had many, many things about Mrs. Nixon from her early days, you know, really teenage years onwards until the presidency starts. That was so useful for that piece. And also a more recent collection that had come in, the Helene and Jack Drown collection. Helene Drown was Pat's best friend, and I think one of the people who knew Mrs. Nixon best of all. And so those were full of letters that were unedited, unredacted, that really gave me a sense of Mrs. Nixon as a person and that personal relationship she had. Also, the Julie Nixon Eisenhower collection, her daughter's, Mrs. Nixon's daughter's collection was excellent for more personal things. And then, of course, on the National Archives side, the NARA oral histories, I used a number of these that were excellent. Stephen Bull, also Connie Stewart. who was essentially Mrs. Nixon's chief of staff. That was just excellent. And then the White House Central Files, the White House Special Files. The Special Files had John Ehrlichman's papers and Bob Haldeman's papers, which turned out to be extremely important. And there are many, many more. I spent weeks and weeks at the library, and there is no substitute for being on site yourself to get your very contained, clean, and not dirty hands on these documents. You just have to see them for themselves in person to get the sense of what you need, what you don't need. But it was just a vast amount of material to go through. And the foundation and the National Archives arm just made it easy for me to do this, even during COVID. And Jason Schwartz was particularly helpful then to help me be able to see some things during that very difficult time. It was a difficult time to be a researcher, as I'm sure Tiffany will know, and Nancy surely knows. So that's hopefully a brief enough summary of what I was able to get into, and it was wonderful.
That's great. Thank you. And we're looking forward to your book. And Tiffany, as you've been researching here, what were some of the additional documents that you came across about Chicanas and Latinas and Mexican Americans related to the Nixon administration?
Yeah, thank you. I think I've mentioned some of them. The photographs of Anita Martinez, Ramona Buñuelos, those to that extent, but also documents related to African American women, Black women, how Nixon recruited them into his administration. Recently, there was a great book published called The Loneliness of the Black Republican. I haven't dived into it, but it kind of pinpoints to that history as well that I'm seeing in my archival search. Other documents, perhaps not related to Mexican American women or Hispanic women, what I'm finding currently researching, I find it very astonishing that at one time how the Republican Party did have feminists in it. And it also had conservative women who were outraged about the ERA, as we know, the history of Phyllis Schlafly in that wing of the Republican Party. But the fact that, how do we grapple with this history of having feminists within the Republican Party who are fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment? And what does that tell us about today in the Republican Party of today, that this history was once there? So those records that I'm currently searching through the Anne Armstrong's records here at Nixon Library, where I'm seeing that play out and those histories with feminists of the Republican Party, but also grappling with that feminists that were Mexican American women, part of the Republican Party, who supported the ERA. So those are kind of documents that are really drawing to me and calling to me. How do we interpret that as a historian? And what does that say about the parties of today, if at one point that existed?
That's great. Thank you. So as a question for all of you, so often when you're researching, there's the document that you come across that you just can't believe it. Your heart kind of stops and you are so excited that it's right there in front of you and you get to hold it and research with it. So what was that document for you, and kind of what did it feel like to find that? So maybe we can start with Nancy and then go to Heath and then to Tiffany.
Well, there are so many. Of course, Mrs. Johnson's audio diary is fantastic. I highly encourage people to listen to it, just to hear her talk about November 22nd and how it started out as a beautiful day is so poignant. In the case of Pat Nixon, people forget sometimes about the audiovisual records. And in the 1972 Republican Convention, there is the most wonderful, and I highly recommend that everyone see it. She gets up to give a speech, okay? For 8 minutes, she cannot talk. Jimmy Stewart introduces her. She gets up, standing ovation. She looks back at him. He tries to get up. Ronald Reagan is there. He gets up. She almost walks away at one point because she can't say anything, continues. Finally, after 8 minutes, she says very short comments. But the importance of it is in 1972, it shows her tremendous popularity, her incredible personality does come through in that audiovisual segment, her graciousness, her humility. So I think that's a wonderful document. And then there are wonderful audiovisual segments of the classic speeches of First Lady Barbara Bush's speech at the Wellesley graduation. Barbara Bush's speech at Wellesley, Hillary Clinton's speech at Beijing, and at the UN Conference on Human Rights. You just get goosebumps when she says, human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. And of course, Eleanor Roosevelt's speeches. And there are so many key documents that document what the important legacies of these first ladies. So there's not just one, there's a wonderful letter, and then I'll quit that. And this changes your impression somewhat of Nancy Reagan, who writes, raised Gorbachev in September of 1985 before the summit and in Geneva. And Nancy Reagan is pushing Ronald Reagan to please get peace with the Soviet Union, much against the advice of many of his advisors. And she writes, in their effort to improve relations between the peoples of the Soviet Union and the United States, I'm sure that we want to do all we can too. So not only is she encouraging the two presidents, but she's also encouraging Raisa Gorbachev, who she was not super close to, but she's reaching out. So I think that is very significant and poignant. Those are just a couple of examples. I could go on and on. The records are so wonderful, but I will stop there.
Oh, thank you. And what about for you, Heath? What was your document or your moment?
Oh, well, there, like Nancy, it's so hard to limit yourself. I mean, there's so much, but I'll just focus on two things. The first were the World War II letters between Pat Nixon and Richard Nixon, which are blow your mind, like so in love, so smitten. And it amused me. There were amusing things in there too, between the differences between the president and Mrs. Nixon. The president, much more emotional, much more effusive, a smitten schoolboy around Pat Nixon, who, by the way, made him drive her to dates with other men for a while, which he gladly did just to have the chance to be around her. So, you know, it kind of blew away a lot of media perceptions you may have heard about the marriage. And you'll, in my book, I mean, I found they had a very loving marriage and were just smitten with each other. So that was just mind-blowing to read these letters. And I did get to see some letters people had not gotten to see before that really made just the whole interpretation of their relationship. It really helped me understand that. So that was one piece. And then the other piece that struck me equally, it was equally as interesting to me, perhaps even a little more so, had to do with actually Secretary Franklin when she was the assistant to the president. I got into, of course, the White House central files where her files are and ran across her. I knew a little bit about Secretary Franklin's work, but not much. And what was in those files became almost a parallel narrative in the book about Mrs. Nixon, because Mrs. Nixon behind the scenes was pushing for women in very subtle ways, moving the needle forward in ways that the media did not give her credit for and the feminist press did not give her credit for. And Barbara's files helped me reveal this whole behind the scenes thing going on. And then, of course, I was so fortunate to get to do interview Secretary Franklin, and have just completed an oral history that I'm actually going to share with the foundation and the National Archive for use if that is of interest. But it was, I mean, it was phenomenal to get to talk to her in concurrently with looking at those documents. It really made this book so interesting from the women's issues perspective. And like Nancy, I could go on for like 10 years, so I will just stop right there.
Oh, thank you. And the same question for you. What was the document that you came across?
I would say, just like Heath, there's several. But one that I think I want to touch on is a document that really kind of cemented the coalitions or the collaborations built between Mexican American women that aligned themselves with the Republican Party, but also Chicanas. Chicanas is an identity term that Mexican American women took on in the 1970s and 1960s to consider themselves more radical, more getting to the root of issues, focused on social justice. So the Chicanas collaborated with Republican Mexican American women to advance issues in the community. They worked with the National Women's Political Caucus. I found some documents here, looking through Anne Armstrong's collection at the Nixon Library, where she herself also collaborated with Democratic women. So those collaborations really gives insight to how impactful it was for them to advance women's equality, women's liberation, and their mission and their agenda. And I think for me, as a researcher and as a historian who writes about Latino, Mexican Americans, and women's history, that was quite pivotal for me when conducting this research.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. And as we start to wrap up our panel, one final question for you. If anyone who is watching or in our audience wants to get started on research, what's one tip you would give them as they get started? So we'll start with you.
Thank you. I would say very straightforward, don't give up. When I began looking at researching at files through presidential libraries. I've been to the Jimmy Carter Library, I've been to the Lyndon Johnson Library, now I've been at the Nixon Library. For historians or researchers that write about women's history, and especially Mexican American women's history, it can feel kind of a hopeless cause when you're searching through these files. But don't give up. I mean, a name matters, their presence matters in the archive. And that can cement their role into understanding what kind of influence they had in shaping the nation's politics and policy, but also in their communities. And so for me, it's don't give up.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And the same question for you, Nancy. What's one tip you would give to someone who wants to start research?
Well, as a former reading room archivist, and I would say I'd give several things. First of all, please do original research, and please do not come, as many scholars do, with the set thesis that you want to fit the documents into. Let the documents go, and they may surprise you as to what you're going to say. Secondly, the National Archives has wonderful and very knowledgeable staff. The Presidential Library staffs are very knowledgeable. I cannot tell you how many researchers I dealt with who came in to the research room and said, now show me everything President Johnson did on education. And I said, well, let me tell you about the file structure, because original records, presidential papers are set out by the office or the person who generated them. Their provenance relates back to them. And so you really need to depend on the archivist, get familiar with the files, and then mention when you have your research interview or to the archivist, I'm really looking for X. And you are liable to find X in a file you never thought of. So learn as much as you can about the papers, but also talk to the archival staff. They will give you very good advice, and continue to do your research, because there are so many jewels. And finally, I would say, don't just limit yourself to the textual files, the audio-visual files. The picture can be worth a million, 1,000 words. The tape recording collections that Nixon, Johnson, and Kennedy are just amazing. Presidents don't tape anymore, but you feel like a fly on the wall when you listen to the tapes. So that's my advice. Sorry, it took
Great.
so
Oh, thank you. And then for you, Heath, what's one research tip you would give to someone who's just starting research?
Something I said a little earlier, sorry, I was muted. So something I said a little earlier, and this is advice a lot of archivists have given me, is go online, look at the collections and slim your list down like your ask so that it is broken down. Because as Nancy said, and I know Tiffany knows this too, if you say, give me everything you have on Pat Nixon, that does not work. So you need to specifically say, okay, these are the files I want to look at, if you can find them online. And fortunately, this library and archive has an excellent online resource and finding aid. So I could slim that list down, give it to Jason at the foundation, give it to the folks on the NARA side, and they could help me from that slim it down some more. So that is very helpful. And the last thing I'll say is archivists are your lifeline. They are the way in. They are the Jedi masters of this universe. And so you need to be, of course, be nice to them, but really listen to them, use them. They are your Sherpas, treat them well, but know that they know far more than you do. And also, as Nancy said, don't come in with a set thesis. It's always going to be completely the opposite of what you think it is. So let your Sherpas guide you through this process and lean on them and their knowledge. They are the lifeline to these documents.
And as a couple of final notes, I just wanted to first thank our panelists. Thank you so much for sharing with us today and for the wonderful resources and stories that you provided. We appreciate all of you, and we hope to have you back here again soon. I also wanted to note that Richard Nixon's presidency is one of the most extensively documented in American history. And here in our collection, we have approximately 46 million pages of textual records, with approximately 20 million currently open and available for research. It was just last year that we had one of the largest declassification openings in our library's history, and there are much more records for you to enjoy and explore. There are also thousands of hours of White House tapes, which are available to researchers, along with approximately 418,000 photographs, 5,300 hours of sound recordings, 5,175 hours of video recordings, and 3,480 hours of film. So it's a very, very extensive collection. There are also private papers that are on courtesy storage with the Richard Nixon Foundation that are here on our site as well that you're able to access. We would love to have you visit us and research with us. We encourage you to reach out and we can help you get started on your project. You can view primary source material pertaining to the life, career, and presidency of Richard Nixon here at the Nixon Library in our research room, Monday through Friday from 9:30 a.m. until 5 o'clock p.m. If you do want to research with us, we do ask that you let us know ahead of time so our staff is able to book you an appointment and walk you through the pre-research process and we can prepare for your arrival. Appointments can be made by emailing nixonreference@nara.gov. And we wanted to thank our panelists again for the wonderful insight, and thank you all for joining us.